Welcome to the Mike and Doug Show. This is Doug. Hi, Mike.
Hi, Doug.
Now, today we're going to talk not only about the hazard circular again, but we're going to talk about what you've been learning about banksters. And now I think you understand, as an engineer who has gone through and accumulated all of the evidence that you'd need, you could put it on a nice Excel spreadsheet and demonstrate that there is no such thing as capitalism, free markets, that all banks, almost all banks except small local banks, are corrupt from the get-go, and that I have a very good reason for why I spit after I say banksters, because they are basically economically enslaving us, and you have the proof of such. So tell us about what you and your miners have been doing down there in the mines and what it is that you brought up to the earth.
We discovered that the Pilgrim Society in 1902 really started organizing the modern effort that we see today. But what happened before that? How did we get to that point? Wouldn't you know it, every time we turned around and looked at another fact, a Rothschild popped up. Then there was this strange relationship between the Rothschilds and the British Empire. Looking at the various conflicts that occurred in the 1800s, starting probably with Napoleon and the War of 1812, we began to see that that was in fact the very time when Nathan Mayer Rothschild began loaning money to the British government for various wars, creating new opportunities for loaning money. They also used their influence in the Bank of England and in Parliament to get the Parliament to actually change their practices for using gold and silver versus the Bank of England note. Well, I used to always think that there was some sort of scientific benchmark between the value of gold and the dollar. I can now definitively say that I get the fact that neither one is true. What we see in our modern banking system is what was created literally in 1812, a fiat money system. There was a lot of discussion going on at the time as to why people would rather take gold and silver in payment for goods and services as opposed to the Bank of England note, which the parliamentary records confirm people considered at about a 1-5 relationship. In other words, one piece of gold versus 5 Bank of England notes. The banksters, most of them slavers, didn't like that. So what they got Parliament to do in early 1812 was pass a gold and silver coin act that redefined a Bank of England note as legal tender and made it on a 1-to-1 par relationship with gold. In 1812, we now have the records showing who the directors of the Bank of England were, and they were all lawyers. And if they weren't a lawyer, they were a sir, a duke, a knight, a viscount. That's it. The Bank of England has been a rigged system from the moment fiat currency was created by them in 1812. And as you know, Douglas, we go back to the source. There's been a lot of discussion about this, but we actually went and found the documents proving everything I'm saying to you right now. This was also the time Rothschild had loaned money to the British Army for fighting Napoleon, but also loaned money to the Army to fight in the United States. So the Rothschilds, from the beginning, the foundation of their modern banking operation was anti-American. What we can now see going through history right up to today, they've always been anti-American.
Well, that brings us into the setup for the U.S. Federal Reserve. Just pointing out that the U.S. Federal Reserve was a bunch of British bankers.
Yeah.
Many of them were Rothschild sponsored. And when you talk about the Napoleonic Wars, that's where the Rothschilds used their carrier pigeon intelligence network to be able to know which way the battle would go, who would win, who would lose. And then that would determine the markets. It would determine the price of gold and silver and interest rates between banks, which the Rothschilds have been setting for a long, long time. Only in recent history did they let go of that, which basically means as long as you had a gold and silver backed currency, you controlled all economics because they could raise it or lower it upon a whim. Two of the largest banks in America have been using silver to basically manipulate the derivatives market for years and years and years. When they were investigated after a 4-year investigation, They said, oh, the U.S. Treasury told us to do it. The U.S. Treasury admitted, yes, we allow them to do that.
You mentioned this carrier pigeon network that the Rothschilds had. And when you think about it in terms of communication, these bankers learned a long time ago if they had intelligence that could affect their investments, they could take advantage of the situation and they could make sure that they profited and other people did not. During the Napoleonic Wars, they used carrier pigeons because that was faster than riding in a carriage and in a ship. Going forward, that same priority has not changed. What they did is they invested in the carrier pigeon. That's confirmed. We found the documents proving that. And then what they started doing was looking at the next development and the next development of communications. Once land telegraphy started, Morse code, the Rothschilds were all over that, and they were implementing those systems in their banks across Europe to make sure that their banks got the information first. Telegraphy was actually quite advanced, and what we're seeing in the newspapers of the mid-1800s is a remarkable amount of uniformity of message across all newspapers, who would then take the telegraph message from Associated Press or Reuters and repeat it in their local newspapers. So what they learned early on is that if they controlled intelligence, then through the communication system, they could maintain their profits forever. And in fact, they started learning they could make up stories and create markets, make them go up and down just based on stories. Nothing ever actually had to happen, and they could make money. So we need to think about communications, whether it's telegraphy, internet, telephone, whatever, as just another form of communications that the Rothschilds have set a high priority of controlling the lives of our grandparents, our great-grandparents, our great-great-grandparents. You know, that's how I got into this whole investigation, because they stole my invention of social networking. And what I realized is that that's just another technology that they knew they had to have in order to maintain this control and this intelligence network. So that explains, in 1909, they formed the Empire Press Union to continue to use the latest technologies to control intelligence, so much so that they gave their newspaper men to the British MI6, MI5, and GCHQ. And that was a part of this banking priority. That's what we got to realize. It's always been about the banks.
Well, it's like the disguise of the Catholic Church behind the Vatican Bank. Well, how could the Vatican Bank be bad? It's the Catholic Church, and they're religious, and they worship God. And the Knights of Malta, well, they're just a nice little philanthropic society, a little organization that gets together to help poor people. And the Pilgrims, well, they're just a dinner club, and sure, they're British, but well, why shouldn't we join together with Britain again in America?
You sure you're not a British propagandist?
I mean, this is the kind of thing that they've told us. And what I'm very happy about is that now you have all the proof to show that from the get-go, the American Revolution, the War of 1812, the Civil War, and most of the wars of our modern times were created by Brits against Americans.
Some of us have heard this, but really didn't know what it meant, that these bankers were providing the resources on both sides of the war. But that is in fact what they have done. We see this Rothschild-centric system that certainly invites a lot of others to play, and they're providing the cash through this fiat money system, where when they need a bunch of cash for a war, they just start printing it and distributing it around. And because in other parts of the world, the value of their economies crash during a war, they use those fiat dollars to then buy up all their assets. So war is a great mechanism for buying up assets cheap and for getting, as you say, cheap labor, slave labor, when in fact what we see now is the British actually gave up on black and brown slaves in 1833. They gave up on them. And what they could do is get these white people to, using the press, fool them into emigrating in various parts of the world, even giving them money to travel and to even get set up. And therefore, once you got a debt slave, you got a slave that was in every way actually more effective than the old slave plantations. because you didn't have to care and feed them. They took care of themselves. And so whites, blacks, red, brown, yellow, we're all slaves to this system. These British servants of Mammon took over the communications systems worldwide. They used them for spying, but more specifically, they used that spying intelligence to further play the banking game. The existing banking system has got to be taken down and replaced with some form of competitive banking system that is tied to some way of holding them accountable.
In Britain, of course, the Bank of England has the Queen's money in it, and the Queen is probably the richest person on the face of the earth. No one knows how much she has, but what she tells the public is complete lies because her offshore accounts aren't even taken into account in terms of her wealth. And so in England, it is illegal to ask about the Queen's business. Well, the Queen's business is in the Bank of England. Right. Therefore, it's essentially illegal to ask about the Bank of England. And that came to America so that today, if you sat down with people and you said the things we're saying, even if you showed them the proof, they would say you're a conspiracy theorist. It's a lie. It's not true. Why? The truth is so shocking that when you're told it, your brain becomes scrambled and you'd rather go back to being complacent and saying, I'll believe the lies I've been told because it's more convenient for my emotional health.
Jesus said in Matthew 6:24, no one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will be loyal to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. What these guys have done is they have taken all the sensibilities of a Christian and they've turned those into propaganda that flip it and make them look like the caring one. We're not looking at some minor demons here. We're looking at Mammon himself, the one Jesus was referring to. Mammon is running the city of London.